Hi everyone, my name is Jane Friedman. Welcome to Funding Your Writing Career, getting organizations and patrons to support your projects. To make money from your writing, I typically look at it as falling into 4 different approaches. None of them are mutually exclusive, of course. You can pursue all of these options simultaneously. But the very traditional method here that I've listed at the top is to sell your books if you're an author, or if you're a freelancer, to sell your articles. And this applies whether you are a traditionally published author or an independently published author. There's a lot of focus for hundreds of years now on selling books in order to earn a living. In the freelance magazine online world, there's been a lot of focus, especially since the arrival of the internet, of securing advertising or sponsorship to sustain publication. This session today is really not focused on either of those. We're focused on selling direct to readers, but not via normal retail channels, like not through Amazon, not through some sort of middle person, and also soliciting patronage, whether that's through individuals or organizations. The biggest principle to remember here, if you're interested in funding your writing through patronage or direct from readers, is that you don't get the money unless you ask. And that is by far one of the biggest barriers. Writers tend to have a psychological block against asking for money, especially a direct ask. But this really is fundamental, that you have to be comfortable putting it out there repeatedly, month after month. The first method of funding that I want to talk about is grants. And this is what we sometimes call free money, because organizations, nonprofits, foundations may offer you basically free money if you apply for it and explain what you would like to use it for. Now, if you're familiar with grants, you may have heard some of the myths surrounding them, one of them being that you have to know someone to get a grant, or that you have to be famous to get a grant. But neither of those is necessarily true unless we're talking about, one of the really, really impressive grants, like a MacArthur Genius Grant, for instance. But that's not what we're really discussing here. I'll talk about the specific type of grants in a moment, but let me go over some more of those mental blocks that relate specifically to applying for grants. First, you can't approach this as if you're asking for permission to write. You already have the permission. We're just looking now for sustainability, looking for different avenues, different revenue streams of making the writing feasible on a financial basis. You can also feel like maybe you're not deserving of the money, especially if you're early in your career or an emerging writer, but there are grants that are specifically to help support beginning writers and emerging writers. So this you have to also get rid of that type of thinking. You may, of course, just lack confidence, and again, it's something you have to get over, put aside. You may not want to try and explain yourself. You may not want to be pinned down to a particular plan, which that's going to happen with grants. You're going to be asked very specifically what you intend to do with the money, but that doesn't mean you can't pursue other projects that aren't funded. And we'll, of course, talk more about what it means to ask for very particular types of funding. And then another block can be the inability to budget for a project that doesn't really exist yet. So you may come up with a project just in order to get a very particular type of grant, and it may be very hard to get specific and concrete about that, particularly on a financial basis of what is needed to make the project go. So we're going to go over some of these issues as it applies to grants and help you get over these mental blocks. The number one way to get a grant is to first already be producing work. So this proves that you're serious, that you can produce something without being given money to start, and it helps offer proof that you can be trusted. So when you produce the work, you also then have to get your work out there in some form. So while new and emerging writers are welcome to apply for many types of grants, again, it helps build trust if you are already doing something on your own, taking initiative to publish, distribute, or do something in the community related to your work. The third step is that you have to have a vision for what you want to accomplish by getting the grant. So you want to apply to grants that are in alignment somehow with your career plans. And the act of writing the grant itself, it forces you to get your ideas on paper and then create a plan for realizing what you want. So the good news here is that even if you don't get the grant, it actually can be very useful from a strategic perspective and a vision perspective of um, setting up what it is you want to accomplish within a specific period of time. There is a wonderful instruction book on grant writing that I would highly recommend for anyone serious about pursuing grants. It's called The Artist's Guide to Grant Writing. It applies to writers and artists and creative people of all types. And she says in this book that the grant writing process is a way to find your own answers to the big questions about your next project. It forces you to ask questions like, how can I do this work? How will this work add to the world? It compels you not only to articulate what kind of art you make, but also why and how you make it. So the common types of grants, let's go through these three categories. First, there are project-specific grants, and that's mainly what I've been talking about so far. They tend to be the most plentiful. However, they can also be the most time-consuming grant applications to put together, and we'll discuss what some of the elements are. You're likely proposing a project that doesn't yet exist, which ties into that mental block I discussed earlier, so it can be a little bit hard to do a project grant for something that you've never attempted to do before. And project-based grants can sometimes involve a lot of unknowns, financial calculations, collaborators that you may or may not have reached out to yet. So sometimes completing these types of grants, again, can be ambitious and challenging, and you may not want to start in that bucket with the project-based grant. It can be a little bit easier to first go after what's called a professional development grant. So these types of grants allow you to be completely selfish and just apply for money to help you take a step in your career, like attend a conference or get a new website built or do things that, again, fall under the umbrella of professional development. And then in the writing community, there's an untold number of fellowships and residencies that you can apply for, often at universities, or you can think about some of the like really major programs like Breadloaf, for instance. And these can be a little bit more quick than a project-based grant because so much rides on your work sample for those types of grants. But there may also be other very challenging components to put together, like letters of recommendation, which we're going to discuss. So to increase your chances of landing a grant, one of the first things to consider is starting local. Is there a local or regional grant that's looking to support people in your city or in your state? For instance, when I lived in Ohio, the Ohio Arts Council was very well known for giving grants to writers and artists alike. And asking for a small amount can give you a few easy wins in the beginning. So like a possible first request might be a professional development grant, $500 to attend a workshop or retreat, or something that would help further your career. Now, let's talk a little bit about the grant proposal elements, especially as it relates to the more complex grants, like a project-based grant, so you understand what you're probably getting yourself into. For some types of grants, there is a prerequisite where you have to do a letter of inquiry first, because they're trying to weed out the people who aren't anywhere near being able to write a great grant that don't have projects that would meet the requirements. But if you don't have to do the letter of inquiry, then you'll have to do the whole grant, which is a huge investment of time. It usually begins with a cover letter and an executive summary. You write these things last because you really need to have the other pieces in place first before you can tackle those effectively. The meat of it is often the project description. We're going to talk more about what goes into that. Then you'll have to have a bio or a resume. Often there's an artist statement that goes into this package. As I mentioned before, some sort of financial calculation or budget about all the money it's going to take to pull off the project. There may be a request for a marketing plan. Almost always you have to put in some sort of work sample, or there might be other supplementary materials or timelines or schedules that you need to include in order to show that what you're proposing is realistic and can be accomplished within a reasonable time frame. And often you'll also be asked for letters of recommendation. So the project description is probably the most critical part of the grant. This is where you have to be really clear and specific about your goals, what's needed to complete the project, and unless there are very specific formatting guidelines that you have to follow to the letter, you should, in this description, use heads, subheads, paragraph breaks. Make this description very easy to read and navigate. Terry Wolverton says that writing a grant is telling a story. It should have a plot. This is where I am now, and this is where I want to go. A protagonist, which is you, or me, the writer, and since panelists don't know who you are, you have to create a memorable character. There are stakes. This is why the people reading the grant should care about you in the project, and then a strong theme. This is how, or this is the significance it will have in the world. This is how it's going to matter. So if you are by nature a storyteller, a novelist, a memoirist, thinking about this sort of structure, the protagonist, plot, stakes, should be quite familiar to you and may help you write that project description, know where to start, and know how it has to feel cohesive. Specificity throughout the grant is going to help it succeed. So again, to reiterate, you have to describe why the project is important at this point in your career and give it a sense of urgency. You may feel as a writer that perhaps what you're doing is not urgent, but it is. If this is the next stage of your career, it's urgent. And the grant is there to help support that next step. That's why these grants exist, to help you. You want to make it clear how the project or how the grant affects your work in the long run, how it will affect the community or the world at large, and be very clear and direct about what you want. Again, this is not the place to get stuck in anxiety or lack of confidence. You have to fake it, even if you don't feel it, and ask for what you need. And again, just to reiterate, vague generalities are the enemy here. You don't want to describe your work in abstract terms like interesting or great or compelling. You want to show how it's these things rather than tell. In all of your language, you want to ensure that you project confidence and enthusiasm that the project will happen, even without the grant. So edit out the tentativeness. You want to edit out the trying and the hoping. And make the funder feel like they're contributing to a project that's on its way to success, or to an artist who's on their way to success. While you want to ask directly for what you want, you don't want to have an air of desperation or so much need that people will feel like you're either whining or that you're going to crumble if you don't get what you need. So it's a really fine line here. You know, you kind of have to play a little game about how it's urgent, but you're not needy. You're confident and this is going to happen, but of course, the grant is required in order to get you to the next level. So it is a very fascinating psychological game that's being played, but you usually can't fail as long as you're projecting energy in the writing and positivity for what you're trying to accomplish, enthusiasm for the project, and why it's going to contribute something. You will have to say something about yourself somewhere in the grant. Usually a bio or a resume will be required. So a bio, again, has to tell a story. It's the story of your life as an artist and your development. And you need to customize the bio for each grant, because each grant you apply for is going to be very different in its considerations in why it's offering grants in the first place. So each story you tell needs to think about that. You have to think about your audience. You write your bio in the third person. And if you have a choice between bio and resume, send the bio, especially if the resume isn't very long, because the story is going to be more compelling in many cases. Now, if you send a resume, you're going to have all of the facts about your career, every single thing that's relevant to the grant, and it's okay if it's very long, as assuming that the grant doesn't stipulate a page limit. You may also be asked for an artist statement, and these can be very confusing for people, especially if you've never written one. You may wonder what it is that you're exactly trying to say here about your philosophy, or what it is that you do and why you do it. It can feel a bit like an existential crisis when you're going through this, but thankfully they don't tend to be very long. usually about a page. That works out to about 250 to 300 words. And you know you've got a successful statement when no other artist could use it, because no two statements ought to be alike, either for yourself for any grant or between two artists. So make sure that this is very customized and about you and what you're trying to accomplish through your work. If you're asked for a budget, you're going to have to figure out your expenses and income for the project. So expenses relate to any materials that are needed, obviously the salary or rate that you want to pay yourself, any kind of travel and lodging that's required, and then marketing. For income, you can have earned income, like if you're charging admission to a show or charging for a book. There can be donated income, where people are giving you donations, like other grants, in fact. And then there are in-kind donations, so like when you make a trade with somebody. Now, when you put together your budget, you have to have expenses equal income. It has to come out to zero in the end. So you, of course, list the grant in the income line and then make sure that it fits with the expenses. If you have any other sources of income, then of course you list them. And the budgets will reveal how thoroughly you've thought this through, how thoroughly you've planned, and it will help inspire confidence that you know what you're doing. For letters of recommendation, you'll want to ask at least a month in advance, if not further out, being sensitive to the fact that some people you may be asking will have other requests, especially if you're asking a professor. In the spring, they may be inundated with requests for recommendation letters to programs or to grants. So before you ask someone, though, if to write you a letter, ask if they feel they can write you a strong letter, because you may be surprised. They may give you a hint that they're not the best person for you to be approaching. Now, when you do make this ask, you should provide the recommender with fact sheets, your resume, a summary of your proposal, as much detail as humanly possible to help them write that letter quickly and in a way that's targeted toward the grant you're applying for. Don't let them steer in the dark or just write off the top of their head. Give them notes. Okay, so that wraps up the grants. Let's talk about crowdfunding, which I think many more writers are familiar with. It's become part of the digital age to be hit up with a request to donate to my crowdfunding campaign for such and such. While crowdfunding is quite popular, though, not everyone follows some of the basic principles. So let's go through the steps involved and how to have a successful campaign. First, not dissimilar to grants, if you want to have a successful crowdfunding project, you have to identify something really in particular that you want people to support. It's really hard to get people to support something that's ongoing and has no finite end to it. Like, support my writing in general is not a very compelling proposition. You want to be thinking about, help me complete this book, or help me get this collection out, etc. You want to have proof that you can do it. Again, very similar to asking for grant money. You have to show that you're not a total babe in the woods and that you've been producing work and that people can have some trust in you. So give proof of what you've done before and give proof of what you're doing now. Here's where a lot of writers misstep. It's in calculating a realistic goal for their crowdfunding campaign. So there's actually a really great guide out there called Crowdfunding for Authors. I recommend it. It's by my colleague, Bethany Joy Carlson. And she goes into all of the facts and figures related to calculating that ask that you're going to make, the goal for the campaign. And she also goes into some other very interesting statistics about what types of campaigns are successful. So she found that the optimal campaign length is about 30 days. That's probably not surprising. That's pretty common. And that campaigns without a great reward under $20 fail about 3/4 of the time. And that's because most of the donations you get are going to be under that $20 mark. So if you don't have a really good incentive there, you're more likely to fail. Pitch videos longer than a minute don't get watched all the way through. We're going to talk about pitch videos in just a second. Campaigns that aren't at least a quarter to a third funded within the first day usually don't fund. So that means you need to seed your success at the beginning, because we like to back projects that smell of success. If we don't think someone's going to reach their goal, we don't want to fund it. And this is a well-known psychological thing that happens in all sorts of areas of life, like in elections. We don't want to back a loser. So you want to know before that campaign launches, who are the 3 or 4 or more people who are going to seed the campaign to make it look like it's on its way to being fully funded. And then successful campaigns under 20,000 are usually 40% funded by a handful of patrons who were courted by the author before the campaign even began. So this is a case of, if you build it, they will not come. You have to do some behind-the-scenes work that isn't necessarily apparent to others who are pledging money, so that you are, again, giving the appearance of success to encourage them to donate. Almost every project ought to have some sort of a pitch video, and pitch videos don't need to be more than a minute, as I said. And fortunately, there are so many great tools today that it doesn't have to be a huge burden to create these. And you don't necessarily have to be on screen with your face asking for the money, although it will be more effective if you do that. But you can show visuals, you should have props, you should definitely write a script where you hit the high points of the project. You don't want to wing it. You do want to create something that shows you and the project in the best light possible. In the project description for the crowdfunding campaign, always list your relationships that will help contribute to the success. So for instance, if you're asking for funding for a book project, you would want to talk about the editor that you've hired and the illustrator who's on board, and that you have such and such marketer who's going to help you with this, and show that you've already got the collaborators in place that will ensure that the project goes well. And then after the campaign launches, you're going to be writing to ask for support for 30 days. And you're going to have a few templates you'll be building off of. You should have a general "I need your help" email that you send one by one to basically anyone who might be thought to possibly support you. And then you also need a separate email, "I need your help" email for evangelists, like the people who already know you, who are your fans, and make sure that you customize your message based on how much that target knows you, knows your work, and what they can potentially do to support you. Sometimes people's support isn't just monetary, it can be in spreading the word, in tweeting or Facebook sharing, or doing something that would get more funds. You should also do a press release, just as you would for a book. And there was actually, I meant to jump over to this point, which is you have to just continuously and until the end reach out in as many places as possible to let people know that this campaign exists. And you may even need to research what blogs, websites, subreddits, social media boards, whatever, where you need to be in order to get people aware of the project. Now, I mentioned rewards a little bit earlier, that anything without a great reward under 20 was less likely to be funded. The key here, though, is that the rewards have to be affordable for you and fairly easy for you to fulfill. You don't want to end up with a reward that's going to take all of your time and energy away from the actual project you're trying to complete. So don't create an unreasonable burden for you to fulfill. Okay, so we've now talked about grants and crowdfunding. Let's move on to donations. And these are just, gifts sometimes falling from the sky. Let's talk about 2 types of donations. One type is just the one-time donation that someone gives you because they saw a donate button somewhere on your site or blog or wherever. And often it's quite straightforward to put a donate button on your site by using PayPal. There are also WordPress plugins that can help facilitate this, like Tiny Coffee. And if you've ever seen the Tiny Coffee plugin, this is kind of what you would see at the bottom of a blog post. It has a little slider, and you can increase the amount that you're tipping someone. It can say coffee. Here it says a glass of Campari, because that's Porter Anderson's favorite drink. Porter Anderson's my colleague. So you can, it doesn't matter which method you use, just something that you can consistently implement. And often, again, it comes at the end of something, like at the end of a blog post, or it may be in the sidebar of your site. One particular writer who uses the donation strategy very effectively is Maria Popova of Brain Pickings. And in fact, her strategy here is a hybrid strategy of donations and affiliate marketing. We're going to be talking, we will not talk about affiliate marketing in this session. That's for another day. But it doesn't matter where you end up on Popova's site, or if you're an email newsletter subscriber, there is always a call to donate. So if you go visit her website, and I encourage you to do that, you'll see that she's not shy about making this call again and again. You can also find tipping and donations a feature of more and more content-based sites. So for instance, Tapas is kind of like a Wattpad, if you're familiar with Wattpad, where writers and readers gather, and writers can create serials. And they can be visual, or like graphic novels, or they can just be text-based serials, although Tapas is more well-known for comics and graphic novels. And if you're posting your work there as an independent author, you can't charge outright. People are going to be able to read your content for free if you're a self-published author using Tapas. However, the users, out of recognition for what you're providing for free, can tip you. And so I think and expect to see more of this kind of tipping behavior introduced at other sites to give readers or your patrons an ability to give back to you. If you look at a site like medium.com, they don't have a direct tipping ability for readers to tip writers, but there is the claps, if you're familiar with that terminology from Medium, basically applause, where people can clap in order to show how much they like your stuff. And then Medium uses the claps to determine what the writer should be paid. So it's kind of an indirect tipping method at that site. Recurring donations are becoming more and more popular to fund writing, and one of the reasons is because of the success of Patreon. There's a competitor to Patreon that's coming up in the ranks, and it's from Kickstarter, in fact. They're working on a platform called Drip, which you may have seen, but it's not yet open to the public. So if you are interested in recurring donations, Patreon is probably the one to go to. There are several different people who use Patreon effectively in the writing community that I can point to just off the top of my head. There are thousands, of course, but three that you might know or should take a look at. Joanna Penn uses it to help support the production of her podcast. Monica Byrne is a literary novelist who, after her first novel came out, launched her Patreon in order to help fund her writing for the second book. And there was a third that I meant to include in here, but clearly forgot. Jay Swanson is a video blogger who has a Patreon where he offers some really nice rewards to people who watch his videos, like he sends postcards, and you can give him missions to complete if you're one of his patrons. So what's so interesting about Patreon, if you're another writer and you're interested in exploring different ways to fund your writing, is that you can see very specifically right here on their Patreon page how much money they're earning per month and how many people it takes to reach that amount and what sort of rewards they're offering. So it's all very transparent, which is a huge strength of this platform in, I think, gathering more people to it, because people start to see the potential for themselves and how they can make it work for what they're producing or creating. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about patronage, but from businesses or organizations. And this gets us a little bit into advertising, which I said we weren't going to talk about. But I consider some sponsorships really kind of a form of patronage more so than advertising, because they're not necessarily getting back something that equates to the value of the dollar spent. They're doing it in order to support a particular community or people in the community or a message or a particular value set. So one example of this is Farnam Street, which is a very popular blog in the business community. And you'll notice that that blog and podcast has sponsors. And when I took this screenshot, their sponsor was Slack. It's an individual, actually, although maybe there's some assistants at Farnam Street, but it's one guy. And you'll notice that the sponsored by is very quiet. I mean, it's just a logo or it's a brand visual. There's no like sales line. There's nothing there that Slack is trying to get you to do. Slack just wants to be associated with Farnam Street because it thinks it's, good branding and it's being a good community member by acting as a sponsor of this content. So that possibility opens up when you've already got a really nice base of people that you're reaching. So you typically need an audience and a well-known brand in order to make a sponsorship work. You will have to pay the IRS on everything that you take in, whether it's a donation or not, unless, of course, you have established yourself as a nonprofit, but I find that pretty unlikely for those of you who are watching. So whether you're collecting funds through PayPal or Patreon, Kickstarter, or any other number of places, you will be responsible for paying taxes on it if you're in the United States. I can't speak to tax law anywhere else, but at least in the US, you're going to receive a 1099-K form. This is very similar to the 1099 MISC form if you're a freelancer that you might receive for freelance payments or from book publishers. It operates in a very similar way. So be prepared for that. And if you're doing any of these ventures on a long-term basis, you may in fact need to start paying quarterly taxes on it if you're earning enough money from it. If you're interested in more options for funding your writing, I highly recommend taking a look at fundsforwriters.com by Hope Clark. This is a resource that's been around for a very long time, I think for as long as I've been working in the industry. It's an email newsletter, it's a website, it's just got great resources for grants, as well as some things that I didn't cover in this session, like contests and competitions. So subscribe to the free version of the newsletter. There's also a paid version that offers even more if the free is not enough. For more information about funding a writing career, take a look at my new book. It's just out from the University of Chicago Press, The Business of Being a Writer. It talks about creating a business model for your writing career that will last decades. I also have a free newsletter. You can sign up at janefriedman.com, and a paid newsletter for authors who are already in the weeds of their careers and are interested in publishing industry analysis. You can find out more and get a trial subscription at hotsheetpub.com. Thanks so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again, I hope, at another Ally event.